The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 3, Side 1. The greatest of medieval Jews was born in Cordova, son of the distinguished scholar, physician, and judge Maimon ben Joseph. The boy received the name of Moses, and it became an adage among Jews that from Moses to Moses there arose none like Moses. His people knew him as Moses ben Maimon, or more briefly, Maimuni. When he became a famous rabbi, the initials of his title and his name were combined into the fond appellation Rambam, and the Christian world expressed his parentage by terming him Maimonides. The probably legendary story tells how the boy showed a distaste for study and how the disappointed father, calling him the butcher's son, packed him off to live with the father's former teacher, Rabbi Joseph ibn Megas. From this poor beginning, the second Moses became adept in biblical and rabbinical literature, in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. He was one of the two most learned men of his time. His only rival was Averroes. Strange to say, these outstanding thinkers, born in the same city only 9 years apart, seem never to have met, and apparently Maimonides read Averroes only in old age, after his own books had been written. In 1148, Berber fanatics captured Cordova, destroyed churches and synagogues, and gave Christians and Jews a choice between Islam and exile. In 1159, Maimonides, with his wife and children, left Spain. For 9 years they lived in Fez, pretending to be Muslims. For there, too, no Jews or Christians were allowed. Maimonides justified superficial adherence to Islam among endangered Jews in Morocco by arguing that we are not asked to render active homage to heathenism, but only to recite an empty formula. The Moslems themselves know that we utter it insincerely in order to circumvent bigots. The head rabbi of Fez did not agree with him and suffered martyrdom in 1165. Fearing the same fate, Maimonides left for Palestine. Thence he moved to Alexandria and Old Cairo, where he lived till his death. Soon recognized as one of the ablest practitioners of his time, he became personal physician to Saladin's eldest son, Nur-ud-Din Ali, and to Saladin's vizier, al-Qadi al-Fadil al-Baizani. He used his favor at court to secure protection for the Jews of Egypt, and when Saladin conquered Palestine, Maimonides persuaded him to let the Jews settle there again. In 1177, Maimonides was made Nagid, or head of the Jewish community in Cairo. A Muslim jurist indicted him in 1187 as an apostate from Islam and demanded the usual death penalty. Maimonides was saved by the vizier, who ruled that a man converted to Mohammedanism by force could not rightly be considered a Moslem. During these busy years in Cairo, he composed most of his books. 10 medical works in Arabic transmitted the ideas of Hippocrates, Galen, Dioscorides, Al-Razi, and Avicenna. Medical aphorisms reduced Galen to 1,500 short statements covering every branch of medicine. It was translated into Hebrew and Latin, and was frequently quoted in Europe under the formula Dixit Rabbi Moises. For Saladin's son, he wrote a treatise on diet, and for Saladin's nephew, Al-Muzaffar I, Sultan of Hama, he composed an essay on intercourse, on sexual hygiene, impotence, priapism, aphrodisiacs. The introduction to this work struck an unhackneyed note. Our Lord His Majesty, Al-Muzaffar, may God prolong his power, ordered me to compose a treatise that would help him increase his sexual powers, as he had some hardship in this way. He does not wish to depart from his customs concerning sexual intercourse, is alarmed by the abatement of his flesh, and desires an augmentation of his virility on account of the increasing number of his female slaves. To these writings Maimonides added several monographs, on poisons, asthma, hemorrhoids, and hypochondria, and a learned glossary of drugs. Like all books, these medical works contain several items not in accord with the passing infallibilities of our time. For example, if the right testis is larger than the left, the first child will be male. But they are marked by an earnest desire to help the sick, by a courteous consideration of contrary opinions, and by wisdom and moderation of prescription and advice. Maimonides never prescribed drugs where diet could serve. He warned against overeating. The stomach must not be made to swell like a tumor. He thought that wine was healthful in moderation. He recommended philosophy as a training in the mental and moral balance and calm conducive to health and longevity. At the age of 23, Maimonides began a commentary on the Mishnah and labored on it for a decade amid commerce, medicine, and perilous journeys by land and sea. Published at Cairo in 1158 as Kitab al-Siraj, or Book of the Lamp, its clarity, erudition, and good judgment at once placed Maimonides, still a youth of 33, next to Rashi as a commentator on the Talmud. 12 years later, he issued his greatest work, written in Neo-Hebraic and provocatively called Mishnah Torah. Here, in logical order and lucid brevity, were arranged all the laws of the Pentateuch and nearly all those of the Mishnah and the Gemaras. I have entitled this work Mishnah Torah, or Repetition of the Law, said the introduction, for the reason that a person who first reads the written law, or the Pentateuch, and then this compilation, will know the whole oral law without needing to consult any other book. He omitted some Talmudic regulations concerning omens, amulets, and astrology. He was among the few medieval thinkers who rejected astrology. He classified the 613 precepts of the law under 14 heads, devoted a book to each head, and undertook not only to explain each law, but to show its logical or historical necessity. Only one of the 14 books has been translated into English. It forms a substantial volume. We may judge the immensity of the original. It is clear from this work and from the later Guide to the Perplexed that Maimonides was not openly a freethinker. He endeavored as far as he could to reduce scriptural miracles to natural causes, but he taught the divine inspiration of every word in the Pentateuch and the orthodox rabbinical doctrine that the whole oral law had been transmitted by Moses to the elders of Israel. Perhaps he felt that the Jews could not claim less for their scriptures than the Christians and Moslems claimed for them. Perhaps he too considered social order impossible without belief in the divine origin of the moral code. He was a stern and dictatorial patriot. All Israelites are bound to follow everything in the Babylonian Talmud, and we should force the Jews of every land to adhere to the customs established by the Talmudic sages. A bit more liberal than most Moslems and Christians of the time, he thought that a virtuous and monotheistic non-Jew would go to heaven. But he was as severe as Deuteronomy or Torquemada on heretics within the Hebrew Pale. Any Jew who repudiated the Jewish law should be put to death. And according to my opinion, all members of an Israelite community which has insolently and presumptuously transgressed any of the divine precepts must be put to death. He anticipated Aquinas in defending death for heresy on the ground that cruelty against those who mislead the people to seek vanity is real clemency to the world. And he accepted without trouble the scriptural penalty of death for witchcraft, murder, incest, idolatry, violent robbery, kidnapping, filial disobedience, and breaking the Sabbath. The condition of the Jews migrating from ancient Egypt and trying to form a state out of a destitute and homeless horde may have warranted these laws. The precarious status of the Jews in Christian Europe or Moslem Africa, always subject to attack, conversion, or demoralization, required a hard code to forge order and unity. But in these matters, and before the Inquisition, Christian theory and probably Jewish practice were more humane than Jewish law. A better side of this stern spirit shows in Maimonides' advice to the Jews of his age. If heathens should say to Israelites, "Surrender one of your number to us that we may put him to death," they should all suffer death, rather than surrender a single Israelite to them. Pleasanter is his picture of the scholar growing into a sage. He approved the rabbinical saying that a bastard who is a scholar of the law takes precedence of an ignorant high priest. He advised the scholar to give 3 hours daily to earning a living, 9 hours to studying the Torah. Believing environment more influential than heredity, he counseled the student to seek association with good and wise men. The scholar should not marry until he has reached the maturity of his learning, has acquired a trade, and has bought a home. He may marry 4 wives, but should cohabit with each of them only once a month. Although connubial intercourse with one's wife is always permitted, this relation too should be invested by the scholar with sanctity. He should not be always with his spouse like a rooster, but should fulfill his marital obligation on Friday nights. When cohabiting, neither husband nor wife should be in a state of intoxication, lethargy, or melancholy. The wife should not be asleep at the time. And so at last is produced the sage. He cultivates extreme modesty. He will not bare his head or his body. When speaking, he will not raise his voice unduly. His speech with all men will be gentle. He will avoid exaggeration or affected speech. He will judge everyone favorably. He will dwell on the merits of others and never speak disparagingly of anybody. He will avoid restaurants except in extreme emergency. The wise man will eat nowhere except at home and at his own table. He will study the Torah every day until his death. He will beware of false messiahs, but will never lose his faith that someday the real Messiah will come and restore Israel to Zion and bring all the world to the true faith and to abundance, brotherhood, and peace. The other nations vanish, but the Jews last forever. The Mishnah Torah irritated the rabbis. Few could forgive the presumption of aiming to displace the Talmud, and many Jews were scandalized by the reported assertion of Maimonides that he who studies the law is higher than he who obeys it. Nevertheless, the book made its author the leading Jew of the time. All eastern Israel accepted him as its counselor and sent him questions and problems. It seemed for a generation that the Geonet had been revived. But Maimonides, not pausing to enjoy his renown, began work at once on his next book. Having codified and clarified the law for Orthodox Jews, he turned to the task of restoring to the Jewish fold those who had been seduced by philosophy or lured into the Karaite communities of heretical Jews in Egypt, Palestine, or North Africa. After another decade of labor, he issued to the Jewish world his most famous work, The Guide to the Perplexed, in 1190. Written in Arabic with Hebrew characters, it was soon translated into Hebrew as More Nebuchim, and into Latin, and aroused one of the bitterest intellectual tempests of the 13th century. My primary object, says the introduction, is to explain certain words occurring in the prophetic books, that is, the Old Testament. Many biblical terms and passages have several meanings, literal, metaphorical, or symbolical. Taken literally, some of them are a stumbling block to persons sincerely religious but also respectful of reason as man's highest faculty. Such persons must not be forced to choose between religion without reason or reason without religion. Since reason was implanted in man by God, it cannot be contrary to God's revelation. Where such contradictions occur, Maimonides suggests, it is because we take literally expressions adapted to the imaginative and pictorial mentality of the simple, unlettered people to whom the Bible was addressed. Our sages have said it is impossible to give a full account of the creation to man. It has been treated in metaphors in order that the uneducated may comprehend it according to the measure of their faculties and the feebleness of their apprehension, while educated persons may take it in a different sense. From this starting point, Maimonides advances to a discussion of deity. That some supreme intelligence rules the universe he deduces from the evidences of design in nature. But he ridicules the notion that all things have been made for the sake of man. Things exist only because God, their source and life, exists. If it could be supposed that he does not exist, it would follow that nothing else could possibly exist. Since in this way it is essential that God exist, his existence is identical with his essence. Now, a thing which has in itself the necessity of existence cannot have for its existence any cause whatever. Since God is intelligent, he must be incorporeal. Therefore, all biblical passages implying physical organs or attributes in God must be interpreted figuratively. In truth, says Maimonides, probably following the Mutazilites, we cannot know anything of God except that he exists. Even the non-physical terms that we use of him, intelligence, omnipotence, mercy, affection, unity, will, are homonyms. That is, they have different meanings when applied to God than is used of man. Just what their meaning is in God's case we shall never know. We can never define him. We must not ascribe to him any positive attributes, qualities, or predicates whatever. When the Bible tells how God or an angel spoke to the prophets, we must not imagine a voice or sound. Prophecy consists in the most perfect development of the imaginative faculty. It is an emanation from the divine being through dream or ecstatic vision. What the prophets relate took place not in actuality, but only in such vision or dream, and must in many cases be interpreted allegorically. Some of our sages clearly stated that Job never existed, and that he is a poetic fiction, revealing the most important truths. Any man, if he develops his faculties to their height, is capable of such prophetic revelations. For human reason is a continuing revelation, not basically different from the vivid insight of the prophet. Did God create the world in time, or is the universe of matter and motion, as Aristotle thought, eternal? Here, says Maimonides, reason is baffled. We can prove neither the eternity nor the creation of the world. Let us therefore hold to our fathers' faith in its creation. He proceeds to interpret the creation story of Genesis allegorically. Adam is active form or spirit. Eve is passive matter, which is the root of all evil. The serpent is imagination. But evil is no positive entity. It is merely the negation of good. Most of our misfortunes are due to our own fault. Other evils are evil only from a human or limited standpoint. A cosmic view might discover in every evil the good or need of the whole. God permits to man the free will that lets him be a man. Man sometimes chooses evil. God has foreseen the choice, but does not determine it. Is man immortal? Here Maimonides applies to the full his capacity for mystifying his readers. In the Guide he avoids the question, except to say that the soul that remains after death is not the soul that lives in a man when he is born. The latter, the potential intellect, is a function of the body and dies with it. What survives is the acquired or active intellect, which existed before the body and is never a function of it. This Aristotelian Averroist view apparently denied individual immortality. In the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides rejected the resurrection of the body, ridiculed the Muslim notion of a physically Epicurean paradise, and represented this, in Islam and Judaism alike, as a concession to the imagination and the moral needs of the populace. In the Guide, he added that incorporeal entities can only be numbered when they are forces situated in a body, which seemed to imply that the incorporeal spirit which survived the body had no individual consciousness. As physical resurrection had become a central doctrine of both Judaism and Mohammedanism, many protests were aroused by these skeptical intimations. Transliterated into Arabic, the Guide made a stir in the Moslem world. A Mohammedan scholar, Abd al-Latif, denounced it as undermining the principles of all faiths by the very means with which it appears to buttress them. Saladin was at this time engaged in a life-and-death struggle with the Crusaders. Always orthodox, he now more than ever resented heresy as threatening Moslem morale in the heat of a holy war. In 1191 he ordered the execution of Surawardi, a mystic heretic. In the same month Maimonides issued a Makala, or discourse, on the resurrection of the dead. He again expressed his doubts about corporeal immortality, but announced that he accepted it as an article of faith. The storm subsided for a time, and he busied himself in his work as a physician and in writing responsa to doctrinal and ethical inquiries from the Jewish world. When, in 1199, Samuel ben Judah ibn Tibbon, who was translating the Guide into Hebrew, proposed to visit him, he warned him not to expect to confer with me on any scientific subject for even 1 hour, either by day or by night, for the following is my daily occupation. I dwell in Fustat, and the Sultan resides at Cairo, 2 Sabbath days' journey, 1.5 miles, distant. My duties to the regent, Saladin's son, are very heavy. I am obligated to visit him every day, early in the morning, and when he or any of his children or any inmate of his harem is indisposed, I dare not quit Cairo, but must stay during the greater part of the day in the palace. I do not return to Fustat until the afternoon. Then I am almost dying with hunger. I find the antechambers filled with people, theologians, bailiffs, friends, and foes. I dismount from my animal, wash my hands, and beg my patients to bear with me while I partake of some refreshments, the only meal I take in 24 hours. Then I attend my patients until nightfall, sometimes until 2 hours in the night or even later. I prescribe while lying on my back from fatigue, and when night falls I am so exhausted I can scarcely speak. In consequence of this, no Israelite can have any private interview with me except on the Sabbath. On that day the whole congregation, or at least a majority, come to me after the morning service, when I instruct them. We study together till noon, when they depart. He was prematurely worn out. Richard I of England sought him as personal physician, but Maimonides could not accept the invitation. Saladin's vizier, seeing his exhaustion, pensioned him. He died in 1204, aged 69. His remains were conveyed to Palestine, where his tomb may still be seen in Tiberias. 6. The Maimonidean War. Maimonides' influence was felt in Islam and Christendom as well as in the Jewish world. Mohammedan pundits studied the Guide under the direction of Jewish teachers. Latin translations of it were used at the universities of Montpellier and Padua, and it was frequently quoted at Paris by Alexander of Hales and William of Auvergne. Albertus Magnus followed the lead of Maimonides on many points, and St. Thomas often considered the views of Rabbi Moises, if only to reject them. Spinoza, with perhaps some lack of historical understanding, criticized Maimonides' allegorical interpretation of the Scriptures as a disingenuous attempt to preserve the authority of the Bible. But he hailed the great rabbi as the first who openly declared that Scripture must be accommodated to reason, and he took from Maimonides some ideas on prophecy, miracles, and the attributes of God. In Judaism itself, Maimonides' influence was revolutionary. His own posterity carried on his work as scholars and Jews. His son, Abraham ben Moses, succeeded him as Nagid and court physician in 1205. His grandson David ben Abraham and his great-grandson Solomon ben Abraham also succeeded to the leadership of the Egyptian Jews, and all three continued the Maimonidean tradition in philosophy. For a while it became fashionable to Aristotelize the Bible through allegorical legerdemain, and to reject the historicity of its narratives. Abraham and Sarah, for example, were merely a legend representing matter and form, and Jewish ritual laws had only a symbolical purpose and truth. The whole structure of Judaic theology seemed about to fall upon the heads of the rabbis. Some of them fought back vigorously. Samuel ben Ali of Palestine, Abraham ben David of Posquier, Meir ben Todros Halavi Abulafia of Toledo, Donna Struck of Lunel, Solomon ben Abraham of Montpellier, Jonah ben Abraham Garundi of Spain, and many more. They protested against selling the scriptures to the Greeks, denounced the attempt to replace the Talmud with philosophy, deplored Maimonides' doubts on immortality, and rejected his unknowable God as a metaphorical abstraction that would never stir a soul to piety or prayer. The followers of the mystic Kabbalah joined in the attack and desecrated Maimonides' tomb. The Maimonidean War divided the Jewish communities of southern France precisely when Orthodox Christianity was waging there a war of extermination against the Albigensian heresy. And as Christian orthodoxy defended itself against rationalism by banning the books of Aristotle and Averroes from the universities, so Rabbi Solomon ben Abraham of Montpellier, perhaps to forestall Christian attacks upon Jewish congregations as harboring rationalists, took the unusual step of anathematizing the philosophical works of Maimonides and excommunicating all Jews who should study profane science or literature, or who should treat the Bible allegorically. The supporters of Maimonides, led by David Kimchi and Jacob ben Machir Tibben, retaliated by persuading the congregations of Lunel, Béziers, and Narbonne in Provence, and those of Saragossa and Lerida in Spain, to excommunicate Solomon and his followers. Solomon now took a more startling step. He denounced the books of Maimonides to the Dominican Inquisition at Montpellier as containing heresies dangerous to Christianity as well as Judaism. The monks accommodated him, and all procurable publications of the philosopher were burned in public ceremonies at Montpellier in 1234 and at Paris in 1242. 40 days later, the Talmud itself was burned at Paris. These events drove the supporters of Maimonides to bitter fury. They arrested the leading adherents of Solomon at Montpellier, convicted them of informing against fellow Jews, and condemned them to have their tongues cut out. Apparently, Solomon was put to death. Rabbi Jonah, regretting his share in the burning of Maimonides' books, came to Montpellier, did public penance in the synagogue, and undertook a pilgrimage of repentance to Moses ben Maimon's grave. But Donna Struck resumed the war by proposing a rabbinical ban on any study of the profane sciences. Maimonides and Asher ben Yehiel supported him, and in 1305 Solomon ben Abraham ben Adret, the revered and powerful leader of the Barcelona congregations, issued a decree of excommunication against any Jew who should teach, or should before the age of 25 dare to study any secular science except medicine, or any non-Jewish philosophy. The liberals of Montpellier replied by excommunicating any Jew who debarred his son from the study of science. Neither ban had any wide effect. Jewish youths here and there continued to study philosophy. But the great influence of Adret and Asher in Spain, and the growth of persecution and fear throughout a Europe now subject to the Inquisition, drove the Jewish communities back into intellectual as well as ethnic isolation. The study of science declined among them. Purely rabbinical studies ruled the Hebrew schools. After its escapade with reason, the Jewish soul, haunted with theological terrors and an encompassing enmity, buried itself in mysticism and piety. 7. The Kabbalah. The isles of science and philosophy are everywhere washed by mystic seas. Intellect narrows hope, and only the fortunate can bear it gladly. The medieval Jews, like the Moslems and the Christians, covered reality with 1,000 superstitions, dramatized history with miracles and portents, crowded the air with angels and demons, practiced magical incantations and charms, frightened their children and themselves with talk of witches and ghouls, lightened the mystery of sleep with interpretations of dreams, and read esoteric secrets into ancient tomes. Jewish mysticism is as old as the Jews. It received influences from the Zoroastrian dualism of darkness and light, from the Neoplatonist substitution of emanations for creation, from the Neo-Pythagorean mysticism of number, from Gnostic theosophies of Syria and Egypt, from the Apocrypha of early Christianity, from the poets and mystics of India, Islam, and the medieval church. But its basic sources were in the Jewish mentality and tradition themselves. Even before Christ, there had circulated among the Jews secret interpretations of the creation story in Genesis and of chapters 1 and 10 of Ezekiel. In the Mishnah, it was forbidden to expound these mysteries except privately to a single and trustworthy scholar. Imagination was free to conceive accounts of what had preceded the creation, or Adam, or what would follow the destruction of the world. Philo's theory of the Logos, or divine wisdom, as the creative agency of God, was a lofty sample of these speculations. The Essenes had secret writings which were zealously guarded from disclosure, and Hebrew Apocrypha, like the Book of Jubilees, expounded a mystic cosmogony. A mystery was made of the ineffable name of Yahweh. Its 4 letters, the Tetragrammaton, were whispered to hold a hidden meaning and miraculous efficacy to be transmitted only to the mature and discreet. Akiva suggests that God's instrument in creating the world was the Torah or Pentateuch, and that every word or letter of these holy books had an occult significance and power. Some Babylonian Geonim ascribed such occult powers to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and to the names of the angels. He who knew those names could control all the forces of nature. Learned men played with white or black magic, marvelous capacities obtainable through alliance of the soul with angels or demons. Necromancy, bibliomancy, exorcism, amulets, incantations, divination, and casting of lots played their part in Jewish as in Christian life. All the wonders of astrology were included. The stars were letters, a mysterious sky writing that only the initiate could read. Sometime in the 1st century A.D., there appeared in Babylonia an esoteric book called Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. Mystic devotees, including Jehuda Halevi, attributed its composition to Abraham and God. Creation, it taught, had been effected through the mediation of 10 sephiroth, numbers or principles, the Spirit of God, 3 emanations therefrom, air, water, and fire, 3 spatial dimensions to the left, and 3 dimensions to the right. These principles determined the content, while the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet determined the forms through which creation could be understood by the human mind. The book elicited learned commentaries from Sadia to the 19th century. About 840, a Babylonian rabbi brought these mystic doctrines to the Jews of Italy, whence they spread to Germany, Provence, and Spain. Ibn Gabirol was probably influenced by them in his theory of the intermediate beings between God and the world. Abraham ben David of Posquier used the secret tradition as a means of drawing Jews away from the rationalism of Maimonides. His son Isaac the Blind and pupil Azrael were probably the authors, circa 1190, of the Sefer HaBahir, or Book of Light, a mystical commentary on the 1st chapter of Genesis. Here the demiurgic emanations of the Sefer Yetzirah were changed into light, wisdom, and reason, and this triplication of the Logos was offered as a Jewish trinity. Eliezer of Worms, 1176 to 1238, and Abraham ben Samuel Abulafia, 1240 to 1291, offered the secret doctrine as a more profound and rewarding study than the Talmud. Like Islamic and German mystics, they applied the sensuous language of love and marriage to the relation between the soul and God. By the 13th century, the word Kabbalah, tradition, had come into general use to describe the secret doctrine in all its phases and products. About 1295, Moses ben Shem Tov of Leon published the 3rd Kabbalistic classic, the Sefer HaZohar, or Book of Splendor. He ascribed its composition to Simon ben Yohai, a Tanna of the 2nd century. Simon, said Moses, had been inspired by the angels and the 10 Sephiroth to reveal to his esoteric readers secrets formerly reserved for the days of the coming Messiah. All the elements of the Kabbalah were brought together in the Zohar. The all-inclusiveness of a God knowable only through love, the Tetragrammaton, the creative demiurges and emanations, the Platonic analogy of macrocosm and microcosm, the date and mode of the Messiah's coming, the pre-existence and transmigration of the soul, the mystical meaning of ritual acts, numbers, letters, points, and strokes, the use of ciphers, acrostics, and backward reading of words, the symbolical interpretation of biblical texts, and the conception of woman as sin, and yet as also the embodiment of the mystery of creation. Moses of Leon marred his performance by making Simon ben Yohai refer to an eclipse of 1264 in Rome, and used several ideas apparently unknown before the 13th century. He deceived many, but not his wife. She confessed that her Moses thought Simon an excellent financial device. The success of the book inspired similar forgeries, and some later Kabbalists paid Moses in his own counterfeit by publishing their speculations under his name. The influence of the Kabbalah was far-reaching. For a time, the Zohar rivaled the Talmud as the favorite study of the Jews. Some Kabbalists attacked the Talmud as antiquated, literalistic logic chopping, and some Talmudists, including the learned Nachmanides, were strongly influenced by the Kabbalistic school. Belief in the authenticity and divine inspiration of the Kabbalah was widespread among European Jews. Their work in science and philosophy suffered correspondingly, and the golden age of Maimonides ended in the brilliant nonsense of the Zohar. Even upon Christian thinkers, the Kabbalah exercised some fascination. Raymond Lully, possibly from 1235 to 1315, adapted from it the number and letter mysticism of his Ars Magna. Pico della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, thought that he had found in the Kabbalah final proofs for the divinity of Christ. Paracelsus, Cornelius Agrippa, Robert Flood, Henry Moore, and other Christian mystics fed on its speculations. Johannes Reuchlin, 1455 to 1522, confessed to poaching upon the Kabbalah for his theology, and perhaps Kabbalistic ideas infected Jakob Böhme, 1575 to 1624. If a greater proportion of Jews than of Moslems or Christians sought consolation in mystic revelations, it was because this world turned its worst face to them and forced them, for life's sake, to cloak reality in a web of imagination and desire. It is the unfortunate who must believe that God has chosen them for his own. 8. Release. From mystic exaltation, messianic disillusionment, periodic persecution, and the hard routine of economic life, the medieval Jews found refuge in the obscurity of their congregations and the consolations of their ritual and creed. They celebrated with piety the festivals that recalled their history, their tribulations, and their ancient glory, and patiently adjusted to their urban existence the ceremonies that once had divided the agricultural year. The vanishing Karaites kept the Sabbath in darkness and cold, lest they violate the law by kindling fires or lighting lamps. But most Jews, while the rabbis winked, brought in Christian friends or servitors to keep the fires burning and tend the lights. Every chance for a banquet was seized with generosity and pomp. The family gave a feast on the circumcision or confirmation of a son, the betrothal or marriage of a son or daughter, the visit of a noted scholar or relative, the occurrence of some religious festival. Sumptuary regulations of the rabbis forbade the providers of such banquets to invite more than 20 men, 10 women, 5 girls, and all relatives up to the 3rd generation. A wedding feast sometimes lasted a week, and not even the Sabbath was allowed to interrupt it. The bridal pair were crowned with roses, myrtle, and olive branches. Their path was strewn with nuts and wheat. Barley grains were thrown over them as a hint of fertility. Songs and quips accompanied every stage of the event, and in later medieval days a professional jester was engaged to ensure full merriment. Sometimes his jests were mercilessly truthful, but almost always he accepted Hillel's genial decree that every bride is beautiful. So the passing generation celebrated its own replacement, rejoiced in its children's children, and subsided into a harassed but kindly old age. We see the faces of such old Jews in Rembrandt's portraits, features bearing the history of the people and the individual, beards breathing wisdom, eyes haunted with sad memories but softened with indulgent love. Nothing in Moslem or Christian morals could surpass the mutual affection of young and old in Judaism, the love that overlooks all faults, the quiet guidance of immaturity by experience, and the dignity with which the life fully lived accepts the naturalness of death. When he made his will, the Jew left not only worldly goods to his offspring, but spiritual counsel. Be one of the first in synagogue, reads the will of Eleazar of Mainz, circa 1337. Do not speak during prayers, repeat the responses, and after the service do acts of kindness. And then the final instruction. Wash me clean, comb my hair, trim my nails, as I was wont to do in my lifetime, so that I may go clean to my eternal resting place, just as I used to go on every Sabbath to the synagogue. Put me in the ground at the right hand of my Father. If the space be a little narrow, I am sure that he loves me well enough to make room for me by his side. When the last breath was drawn, the eyes and mouth of the dead were closed by the eldest son or the most distinguished son or relative. The body was bathed and anointed with aromatic unguents and wrapped in spotless linen. Almost everyone belonged to a burial society, which now took the corpse, watched over it, gave it the last religious rites, and accompanied it to the grave. In the funeral, the pallbearers walked with bare feet, The women preceded the bier, chanted a dirge, and beat a drum. Any stranger who encountered the procession was expected to fall in with it and accompany it to the grave. Usually the coffin was placed near those of dead relatives. To be buried was for a man to lie with his fathers, to be gathered unto his people. The mourners did not despair. They knew that, though the individual might die, Israel would carry on. Book 4. The Dark Ages, 566 to 1095. Chapter 18. The Byzantine World, 565 to 1095. 1. Heraclius. If now we turn from the oriental side of the endless duel between East and West, we are soon moved with sympathy for a great empire harassed at once with internal discord and, on every side, external attack. Avars and Slavs were crossing the Danube and taking possession of imperial lands and towns. Persians were preparing to overrun western Asia. Spain was lost to the Visigoths, and the Lombards, 3 years after Justinian's death, conquered half of Italy in 568. Plague swept the empire in 542 and again in 566. Famine in 569. Poverty, barbarism, and war broke down communications, discouraged commerce, stifled literature and art. Justinian's successors were men of ability, but only a century of Napoleons could have coped with their problems. Justin II, from 565 to 578, fought vigorously against an expanding Persia. Tiberius II, from 578 to 582, favored by the gods with almost every virtue, was taken by them after a brief and just reign. Maurice, from 582 to 602, attacked the invading Avars with courage and skill, but received little support from the nation. Thousands entered monasteries to escape military service, and when Maurice forbade the monasteries to receive new members until the danger was over, the monks clamored for his fall. The centurion Phocas led a revolution of the army and the populace against the aristocracy and the government in 602. The 5 sons of Maurice were butchered before his eyes. The old emperor refused to let the nurse of his youngest child save it by substituting for it her own. He himself was beheaded. The 6 heads were hung up as a spectacle for the people, and the bodies were cast into the sea. The Empress Constantina, with her 3 daughters, and many of the aristocracy, were slain, usually with torture, with or without trial. Eyes were pierced, tongues were torn out, limbs were amputated. Once more the scenes of the French Revolution were rehearsed. Khosrou II took advantage of the disorder and renewed the old war of Persia against Greece. Phocas made peace with the Arabs and transported the entire Byzantine army into Asia. He was everywhere defeated by the Persians, while the Avars, unresisted, seized nearly all the agricultural hinterland of Constantinople. The aristocracy of the capital appealed to Heraclius, the Greek governor of Africa, to come to the rescue of the empire and their property. He excused himself on the ground of age, but sent them his son. The younger Heraclius fitted out a fleet, sailed into the Bosporus, overthrew Phocas, exhibited the mutilated corpse of the usurper to the populace, and was hailed as emperor in 610. Heraclius deserved his title and his name. With almost the energy of Heracles, he set himself to reorganize the shattered state. He spent 10 years in rebuilding the morale of the people, the strength of the army, and the resources of the treasury. He gave land to peasants on condition that the eldest son in each family should render military service. Meanwhile, the Persians captured Jerusalem in 614 and advanced to Chalcedon in 615. Only the Byzantine navy, still controlling the waters, saved the capital and Europe. Soon afterward, the Avar hordes marched up to the Golden Horn, raided the suburbs, and took thousands of Greeks into slavery. The loss of the hinterland and of Egypt cut off the city's supply of grain and compelled abolition of the dole in 618. Heraclius, desperate, thought of transporting his army to Carthage and thence attempting to retake Egypt. The people and the clergy refused to let him go, and the Patriarch Sergius agreed to lend him the wealth of the Greek Church, at interest, to finance a holy war for the recapture of Jerusalem. Heraclius made peace with the Avars and at last, in 622, set out against the Persians. The campaigns that followed were masterpieces of conception and execution. For 6 years, Heraclius carried the war to the enemy and repeatedly defeated Khosrou. In his absence, a Persian army and a host of Avars, Bulgars, and Slavs laid siege to Constantinople in 626. An army dispatched by Heraclius defeated the Persians at Chalcedon, and the garrison and populace of the capital, roused by the Patriarch, scattered the barbarian horde. Heraclius marched to the gates of Ctesiphon. Khosrou II fell. Persia pled for peace and surrendered all that Khosrou had taken from the Greek Empire. After 7 years' absence, Heraclius returned in triumph to Constantinople. He hardly deserved the fate that shamed his old age. Weakened by disease, he was devoting his last energies to strengthening the civil administration when suddenly wild Arab tribes poured into Syria in 634, defeated an exhausted Greek army, and captured Jerusalem in 638. And even as the emperor lay on his deathbed, Egypt fell in 641. Persia and Byzantium had fought each other to a common ruin. Under Constans II, from 642 to 668, the Arab victories continued. Thinking the empire beyond saving, Constans spent his last years in the west and was killed in Syracuse. His son Constantine IV Pogonatus was abler or luckier. When through 5 crucial years, from 673 to 678, the Moslems made another effort to take Constantinople, Greek fire, now mentioned for the first time, saved Europe. The new weapon, allegedly invented by Callinicus of Syria, was akin to our flamethrowers, an incendiary mixture of naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and pitch. It was thrown against enemy ships or troops on flaming arrows, or blown against them through tubes, or shot on iron balls bearing flax and tow soaked in oil. Or it was loaded and fired on small boats which were set adrift against the foe. The composition of the mixture was a secret successfully guarded for 2 centuries by the Byzantine government. To reveal any knowledge of it was treason and sacrilege. The Saracens finally discovered the formula and used Saracen fire against the Crusaders. Until the invention of gunpowder, it was the most talked-of weapon in the medieval world. The Moslems made another assault upon the Greek capital in 717. An army of 80,000 Arabs and Persians under Moslema crossed the Hellespont at Abydos and besieged Constantinople from the rear. At the same time, the Arabs fitted out a fleet of 1,800 vessels, presumably small. This armada entered the Bosporus, overshadowing the straits, said a chronicler, like a moving forest. It was the good fortune of the Greeks that in this crisis an able general, Leo the Isaurian, replaced the incompetent Theodosius III on the throne and assumed the organization of defense. He disposed the small Byzantine navy with tactical skill and saw to it that every ship was well supplied with Greek fire. In a little while the Arab vessels were aflame, and nearly every ship in the great fleet was destroyed. The Greek army made a sortie upon the besiegers and won so decisive a victory that Moslema withdrew to Syria. 2. The Iconoclasts, 717 to 802. Leo III derived his cognomen from the district of Isauria in Cilicia. According to Theophanes, he was born there of Armenian parentage. His father moved thence to Thrace, raised sheep, and sent 500 of them, with his son Leo in the bargain, as a present to the Emperor Justinian II. Leo became a guardsman of the palace, then commander of the Anatolian legions, finally, by the convincing suffrage of the army, emperor. He was a man of ambition, strong will, and patient perseverance, a general who repeatedly defeated Moslem forces greatly superior to his own, a statesman who gave the empire the stability of just laws, justly enforced, reformed taxation, reduced serfdom, extended peasant proprietorship, distributed lands, repopulated deserted regions, and constructively revised the laws. His only fault was autocracy. Perhaps in his Asiatic youth, Leo had imbibed from Moslems, Jews, Manichaeans, Monophysites, and Paulicians a Stoic Puritan conception of religion that condemned the addiction of popular Christianity to image worship, ceremonialism, and superstition. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.